All right. Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan, and my co-host Jungjun is in China right now, and it's a pretty early morning recording here, or late-ish morning recording in the States. So he wasn't able to join, but I'm happy to have Nicole from Tea for Me, please. So thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.
So before we jump in, could you share a little bit about Tea for Me, please, and your background? I remember that your blog was like one of the first ever when I was just getting into tea. I think it was like 11 years ago now. Like you were like one of the few tea bloggers back then in English, and there's like that was a really small world.
Yeah,
So I've been aware of what you've been doing for a very long time.
definitely. Yeah, my blog just turned 16 earlier this
Wow,
month. So I've
incredible!
been at it quite a while. But I started out just drinking regular grocery store tea bags with milk and sugar. And then when I went away to college, my classmates were drinking coffee and I didn't like coffee at the time. So I started exploring different teas as, just to get through all nighters writing papers, and I got really lucky because around that time I found a website that was looking for staff tea reviewers. So basically they would send me big bags of tea samples from all over the world and I would just write about them. So I was dorming at the time. Free stuff is great when you're in college, and it was really just a super great early introduction to tea, where for a lot of people it's a much more gradual exploration, where I just had like everything but the kitchen sink thrown at me, to write about. I basically started my blog initially to back up the reviews I was writing for them. Eventually, that site shut down, but by that time, my blog had kind of taken on a life of its own.
Yeah, it's such a great resource. And
Thank
all the
you.
interviews that you've done over the years, it's a great compilation of knowledge. And so I kept finding myself back there, especially in my early tea journey, because I find you write very accessibly. Like I think it's, whether or not you know a lot about tea or you're just getting into it, it's very easy just to pick up, will I like this tea, or how can I build my preferences, or like, what is matcha? Like, those are important resources to have. So you've been in the game a really long time and you've seen probably a lot of evolution. So, like, to my knowledge, looking backwards at how the matcha trend happened in the US, the general narrative that I've heard online, and I've lived through kind of the early-ish parts of it when I was a tea person, was that around 2013, 14 and 15 is when things really started to blow up. And then before that, there was matcha, but it wasn't as popular. How has that evolution, particularly in the US market, evolved from your perspective?
Yeah, it's definitely, I would say when I first started my blog, matcha was something we heard about, but it wasn't something you would just find at your normal tea store. Finding a chasen was like impossible.
Wow.
If you went to Whole Foods, you might be able to find some matcha. The quality was not necessarily where I would think where it's accessible to get now. Definitely. It's definitely become just something that's gotten a lot more interest. I find especially, looking back at my most popular blog post for the longest time was my review of Lipton Yellow Label.
Okay. Really?
But within the last 5 years, all of my most popular posts are to do with matcha. So like how
Whoa.
matcha without a whisk, just different things about matcha that, that's basically what Google is sending me the most traffic, which I think definitely shows the increased interest.
And at what point do you think general matcha awareness happened? Like where is that in the timeline?
Yeah, I think maybe around 2012 or so. I think honestly my first time having matcha was at Starbucks, and I think for a
Okay.
lot of people that was their introduction to matcha. Now most coffee shops do offer a matcha latte, but definitely wasn't the norm back then. But I definitely think, that was kind of the start of it, is just, introducing people to that taste. Even if it did have a lot of sugar added, it's definitely like a different taste than I would say most Americans are used to.
And what point did you get the sense that like, the specialty coffee scene really started adopting it onto their menu? Because like in my consumer journey, I remember it around 2017, maybe 2018, is when it really was like, oh, whoa. And I was taking, I like Chano Yu teachers for traditional Japanese tea ceremony. And I remember that was a novelty to them. They were like, oh, whoa. Like you go to New York, go to these coffee places, they have matcha. Like it was almost an unbelievable thought when it was getting some of their reactions. But when did you start like really noticing it in around the New York area?
Yeah, I would say probably around 2018 or so. We definitely had like a boom of matcha cafes that, just strictly did matcha, which, were super popular. New York goes through these phases where it could be cupcakes, it could be anything that
Yeah.
just froyo. Like you just get a ton of places opening up about one particular thing. And we did have a little bit of a matcha boom around then, that I think it really became part of lifestyle for people where it hadn't really been.
That's a good way of putting it. Definitely feels lifestyle, especially a lot of those earlier brands that were in New York. So something that we're very curious about in this podcast and like in my own like educational matcha journey is around product positioning for matcha and the way people can describe it with different levels of transparency or do more lifestyle branding versus more like hype beast branding or more like deep in the weeds cultivar branding. Like, at what point did you see matcha brands start branching away from like ceremonial grade and culinary grade as the only type of product classification into like single origin okumadori, for example?
I'd say only about 5 years ago or so, it definitely wasn't something that was known. Like a Japanese tea vendor, like maybe me, had always had, different cultivars, but Yabukita is like the most widespread cultivar in Japan. So even that, like almost every matcha that was accessible was Yabukita. It definitely,
Mm.
I think it's only recently that, I think the market is a lot more interested in learning more about matcha and the different types of matcha. Matcha used to be just like a monolith, like it was one thing.
Yeah.
And now it's like there's so much more connoisseurship to it, which is interesting. I found recently just the popularity of matcha, especially on TikTok, is really, really fascinating to me because there's all these people suddenly talking about different cultivars and brands that I'm like, how did you find out about this?
At what point do you think that's going to start trickling down to like cafe or retail experiences? Because you have a handful of people, like you have Kettle and a couple others, but like it feels like it's a slow trickle to see like a cafe offering the same level of transparency as they would a coffee, for example.
Yeah, I think it definitely is just a slow transition towards that. I think just as the market demands change, coffee, that's definitely been there for a while where, they'll tell you where it came from and what variety of bean it is and where it was, how it was roasted, and all these different like micro information that, you know, say 25, 30 years ago, really you would just get a cup of coffee. You didn't know anything about it. So I think it's going to take a while still for it to really trickle down to that level. But I do think that's going to happen eventually.
Yeah. One thing I've noticed is that in the coffee scene, it seemed to trickle the other way, where those like the Blue Bottle, Intelligentsia, Stumptown experiences happened first at cafe and retail, which drove like direct consumer interest. What's really interesting here, and maybe it's social media, I don't know, maybe it's the current environment that we're in, it really seems to be going the other way where I think there is all this consumer demand for matcha that are developing relationships with companies and getting educated online and then demanding that from their cafes. So like but coffee was really a push onto the consumer from the businesses, I feel, and the matcha really feels like a pool where they're like we want matcha, we want coffee alternatives. That's it'll be interesting to see like the comparison and how that evolves over the years.
Right. I think, there's the standard of cafe matcha is definitely changing where, you could get away with serving like a kind of terrible matcha for a long time, but that's not really, possible anymore. I think the consumers are more knowledgeable about it. That, there's a coffee place by my job that stores their matcha in this glass jar where the whole outside of the jar is like gray from
Okay.
oxidation. But I definitely like eavesdrop, and when I'm there, I hear people being like, the matcha shouldn't be that color.
Yeah. Well, what I find optimistic is looking around at these cafes that serve matcha of this quality and just how many people love it. Like,
Absolutely.
imagine what they would like if they tasted like the good stuff. It makes me very optimistic. So, pivoting topics a little bit, so a new trend that we've seen, I'd say, in the last 1 to 2 years is influencer matcha, where we have all these matcha reviewers on the internet that have decided to either white label or do direct sourcing their own brands. So what's your take on influencer or reviewer matcha?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting trend. I it's fascinating because they all, talk about using very high quality ceremonial grade, but often they're making lattes, which kind of defeats the purpose of using a very, very high quality matcha in a way. It's definitely very interesting. I think there's kind of a gap of knowledge where, I review tea too, so I get like just giving your opinion, but especially for something like matcha, if that's all you're doing and you're basically people are turning to your videos for education, I think it's definitely important to really understand high quality matcha versus, what they may have in their head as just a consumer. It's a catch 22.
Yeah. And I worry about bias. I think there's a lot of people who are very good actors, but there's like the way I see it, there's like implicit and explicit bias. Like they could say explicitly, like mine is the best, and or bash on others. But you know, most people wouldn't do this because everyone would call them out for it. But you could do it really implicitly. Like I can't imagine any influencer who owns a matcha brand ever saying they tasted a new sample and they like it more and it's at a better price than what they're selling. Like they would never say that. So it's a gray area, I think.
Yeah.
Moral standing. If you're like a tea reviewer, like I don't know, like we're just starting to bring products to market. We have a whisking bowl and we'll have other stuff, but it's so hard bringing stuff to market. And it's almost a little bit unfair to any of these brands who do their sourcing and are trying to sell stuff. It's like so hard to do that and to sit in that seat when you have a huge audience, both selling and reviewing. It's it's an ethical dilemma, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And reviewing other brands when you also own a brand is also kind of I think a moral gray area in a way too.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves. I don't think there's anything anyone can do to change it, but it's there are a lot of small businesses out there that I hope don't get too affected.
Absolutely.
So something that actually we've talked about a little bit in the past, but we have a lot of people on this podcast that own matcha brands or tea companies or somehow involved in the industry. But could you give everyone a good framework? Because you are an influencer, you're a writer, you're an educator, you're a reviewer. What is the best way for industry people to interact with tea influencers and reviewers and educators?
I find just being like human. One of my favorite things is that just, when somebody takes the time to just talk to me as a person, that, like one of my favorite examples is Lauren from Mizuba Tea. But right before she kind of launched, I was at World Tea Expo and I get this DM on Instagram, and it was like I didn't even really recognize the username. She was like, "Oh my god, I have to meet you. Meet me over here." And I was like, "Okay," like I have this weird thing where I meet people from the internet for tea a lot, and my husband's always like, "You're gonna get kidnapped." But she just, really as soon as she knew I was at the Tea Expo, she made it a point to like reach out and have me meet up with her and really just to talk. She didn't give me samples. She didn't do anything other than just like, I want to meet you, and we really developed a really great friendship from that. And I find that that's my favorite thing about tea is that it really does connect me with so many people all over the world. I have so many friends who are tea vendors now, but I think it's really the ones that really take the time to make connections are the ones that really stick in my mind.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. So when it comes to tea education, there are completely independent sites like yours, and then there's a lot of vendor driven education where ultimately, right, it's some form of content marketing where they're trying to sell you something. And even, as us as a matcha equipment company, we engage in that too. Right? It's a great way to get SEO, it's a great way to put out opinions. But where have you seen the best of tea education mixed with commercial interest? And where have you seen the worst, like snake oil sales type And where would you draw the line between okay and not okay?
Yeah, that it is tough. I definitely there's some great vendor sites out there that, if you have a question about tea and you just Google it, there's some really great resources out there that I'll even use as, sources when I write my blog posts. I definitely think the line for me comes down to health benefits because I feel like that's kind of the one topic that, people love to make whatever their tea they're selling sound like the healthiest thing in the world that's going to cure every ill, which definitely I think is not great for consumers. I don't drink tea because of the health benefits, and there are definitely people who do, but I think you have to balance that and make sure you're not towing the line into crossing the FDA or something like that, where there really are regulations and there are tea companies that do get fined for overhyping health benefits because they're not something that can be promoted in certain ways. And I think it's important for companies to be mindful of that, but also consumers that, if a company is telling you that tea is going to cure something, that's definitely kind of a red flag for me.
Oh, I totally agree. And seeing some of that over the years, it's really you hate to see it. It's very painful. 'Cause a lot of people just don't know any better. Like it's
Yeah, absolutely. Especially the weight loss things,
mm,
because you're preying on people's insecurities.
yeah,
And I always say, I drink so much tea, I would disappear if it made you lose weight. I still have to exercise like everyone else.
tea is definitely not a cure-all. I've noticed that too. When it comes to like consumer tea education journey and pathways of people like develop a passion for tea or develop a passion for matcha, I've found that like great retail experiences can really transform someone's perspective. And when I was in high school, I just loved going to the Philadelphia Tivana and how they would waft the tea in your face. And it was this big sensory experience. And you could taste all these different things, pure or unblended. So, like, over the years, what have you discovered makes a really great consumer retail experience?
Absolutely. I worked at Tivana, and that definitely, was a really great experience that I think is missing from the marketplace somewhat. That, to really help people like touch and see and smell the tea, in a way like that that is super approachable. I think matcha is something that I think part of the popularity is that it is almost like a show when somebody's making matcha for you. Watching
Yeah,
somebody make matcha is, even if it's in a cafe setting, it's really a very different experience versus something else. I think it kind of comparable to like pour over coffee being so popular. I think it's kind
yeah,
of a similar, like, just more slow and meditative thing that I think that is part of why I think matcha has become so popular. There's a chain of matcha cafes in New York called Matchaful. And every time I'm there, it's really cool to see people's reactions and they kind of just like zone out watching them whisk. I think it is really important to create those experiences for people because it's something memorable and it helps them connect more with tea.
yeah, absolutely. And like even watching people look at a chasen and realize, whoa, this is made out of one piece of bamboo, and just you see the dots connect.
Absolutely.
So on any consumer journey, especially for like matcha or tea, like people will fall off. Right. For example, like for Japanese tea ceremony, I would say I'm someone who fell off the bandwagon. I like it. I appreciated it. I studied it for 2 or 3 years, but I learned enough to realize, this is not the path that I want to take. But same could be for like matcha or tea journey or any tea journey. So at what point over the years, have you noticed that people fall off the bandwagons? Like, where are these, like, I'll call them opportunities for tea companies or tea educators to try to nudge people back into becoming a tea person versus saying, oh, it's too much effort, I don't want to do it, or some other reason why it's not part of their daily life?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think one the industry has been trying to figure out for a while. I think part of it is accessibility. You know, Even now, there's lots of things available online, but I can't walk into most stores in my area and find a good quality tea. So if you're somebody
Yeah,
who doesn't have, the commitment to go and find different teas and continue to buy them online, have them shipped to your house. Accessibility is definitely an issue. I think that's one that I think is probably the biggest. I know, we mentioned Tivana earlier. It just was easy for people to, when they were at the mall, to just pop in and buy some tea. And I think that definitely makes it difficult for consumers. I think also just making it easy for them. There's so many tools for making tea out there, and gadgets and gizmos and different things. But I think sometimes just making it really simple for people is the best way to make sure they're going to continue to drink tea, and make it part of their lifestyle. If it has to become a whole thing, like I'm someone who I do enjoy gong fu tea. Do I do it every day? No. Who has time for that? you know, it definitely, I think, unless tea is firmly a part of your lifestyle, it is really difficult to maintain that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Although I think as a tea community, sometimes the atmosphere online feels less inclusive when it comes to accessibility. Like people say, "Oh, I should not use these automated tools." But if it's the difference between someone doing it every day, it's a weird space because one, like I guess like the like really hardcore tea people want people to move down a traditional path or a connoisseurship path and like really talk down on some of these automated tools or these more watered down techniques. It's a weird thing because I think they want more tea people, but not everyone's destined for that.
Absolutely. I have a video I made of like a review and how to use the Breville automated tea maker, which has been that thing's been around for like 15 years. But it's just a really simple, easy way to make tea. Like at least once a month, I get a comment on that video being like, "Who needs this? It's not hard to make tea." You know, it just I'm like, it's if it's not for you, that's fine. But there's definitely people who aren't going to drink tea unless they can have something automated like that I think there's definitely space for that. Especially as tea people, we tend to almost have like tunnel vision of, the only tea we experience is the tea we like and people who like
Mm.
the tea we like. If you're on the tea Discord and you're, doing lots of gung fu and you're on Instagram and you're sharing your tea, that's the only tea you're experiencing. But the rest of the world is doing tea in so many other different ways that I think it's good to like keep perspective of that, to keep you from having your tea point of view be too narrow.
Yeah, that makes sense. Where would you say some of the best online spaces are to be a part of a tea community?
Yeah, the tea Discord is definitely like a really nice one. I think there's a ton of different people there, and they talk about a lot of different things. I know Reddit gets a bad rap, but I think the tea subreddit is also can be a really nice community. You always get your one or two bad apples, but generally it's not too bad of a space, I think.
If not nice, it's entertaining.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, it's interesting as things evolve. When I first started my blog, Twitter was like the place. I actually started my Twitter account before I even started my blog. So
Oh, okay.
the name actually came from my Twitter account because I was just looking for people to talk about tea with. And through that, I connected with people that I'm still friends with now, digitally. Over time, that changed. We had a really nice tea community on Google Plus when that was a thing.
Okay.
I think Instagram is probably like the main place that tea is. I think if you follow a few people that post about tea and you post about tea often enough, you're going to find a community there. There's definitely some really, really nice people. Tea people generally tend to be really nice people in my experience. So I think, especially if you're somebody who doesn't have a tea community where you are, I think Instagram is a really good place to post content and see other people talking about tea too.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I really like Instagram for tea, especially to see who's connected to everyone. That's always interesting. It's like, oh wow, that guy follows this person, and like, wow, like they must be like cool or good. Like you can discover the like a social web.
Definitely.
So you're near New York City, and you've written a lot about the New York City scene. So how have you seen that evolve for matcha over the past couple of years? Because it's like it's exciting. It's like really cool what the options are. But how,
Yeah.
how has that evolved over the years, and Where are some tea houses or cafes that you could recommend people go to get like different styles of cafe experiences for matcha?
Yeah, it's definitely been really cool to see. I know when I first started, there really weren't too many options for tea places, but now there definitely is, and super diverse. Definitely when it comes to matcha, I think Kettle is kind of like the kind of pinnacle of that in the city. you know, Even just I love going to their flagship store in Brooklyn, because they have the huge matcha grinder in the case going all
Yeah.
the time, and just seeing people who wander in, seeing that, like it really blows their mind to see first of all how long it takes to make matcha. Just watching that thing go, but definitely like being able to sit down at the bar and talk to somebody about tea, and even if it's like a matcha parfait, but it I think it's a really great way to introduce people to matcha in a way that's like not snobby, not unapproachable, but definitely I think it still gives respect to the product and like where it comes from. I think that's important because there's definitely like some matcha places in the city that are a little bit more of like just aesthetic, and there's really no connection at all to where matcha comes from. I think it's really important for places who sell matcha and serve it to honor Japan in that way. And so that's definitely, I think Kettle is really, really wonderful for that. I also really love Setsugeka. They're a wonderful matcha place, and to be able to sit on a tatami mat and drink matcha from a chuan in the middle of New York City is a really cool experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're the closest you can get to a tea ceremony
Absolutely,
in New York, but while still being, like, not overly formal. I really like the intentionality there.
absolutely.
They are, like, unapologetically slow, and I really mean that as a compliment. Like, they do not rush. Everyone gets treated the same way, same intention,
Mhm.
everything, like, they have their moves.
Yeah.
It's very almost, what's the word? Meditative to watch them.
Absolutely. Sometimes I'll see people almost give, like, a bad review of it, and I'm like, "That's the point."
Yeah, it's painful. Not everything's for everyone, but,
Absolutely.
it's a nice contrast, and I could see how the average New Yorker would walk in and be like, "Wow, I'm not waiting 20 minutes." But, like, that's kind of the point. Like,
Absolutely.
that's why it's there.
Yeah, it's more of a destination.
Yeah, definitely a destination. Great location too. Cool. Well, you've also written a book that was recently published, I believe about a year ago? Is that right?
Yeah, yeah, right there. It
Yeah.
came out in 2022. So it's a recipe book. Basically, my publisher wanted a book of tea recipes. It was kind of a bit of a battle to make it where it had the things I wanted to include, as well as everything they wanted to include. But there's definitely like lots of matcha recipes in there. I have like a way to make boba from scratch in your microwave.
Cool, okay.
Yeah,
Microwave. Nice. Love it. Yeah, that's cool. Actually, I wouldn't even imagine how
Yeah, so in most recipes either use pre-made boba, which I was like, it's impossible to make a recipe that way because every brand is different. Most of the ones I tried were terrible.
Mm,
And then
yeah.
most recipes made a huge batch and it doesn't stay good for very long. You really only have a couple hours to consume it before it's really just turns to mush. And so, I really struggled with that because it was like, how do you make this recipe for like a glass of boba and then you still have all this leftover? It just felt so wasteful. So I kind of kept scaling back and scaling back and scaling back to where it was just enough boba for like two drinks. And so I think it's really helpful for people to, if they want to make boba at home, they don't want to spend $10 on a drink every day. It just makes it really more fun and accessible, I think.
So, I was at the Toronto Tea Festival where you presented that, I guess it was about a year ago or a little bit less, and you had a really interesting story about certain famous celebrities stealing a, recipe from your book.
Yeah, so I had a recipe for matcha whipped cream, which is in the book. It's also just on my blog. It was a recipe, which is what whipped cream is the easiest thing in the world to make at home. Really, the recipe is make whipped cream, throw some matcha in it. But Kourtney Kardashian's website basically took my recipe and posted it on their site and made a video, like a reel on Instagram with it.
Wow,
Didn't
really?
credit
Okay.
me, didn't, in any way credit me for that. And so, I had posted it on my Instagram and had lots of people go and comment to say like, "Hey, this is Nicole's recipe. You should give her credit." Eventually, they did add credit, but when I asked to be compensated for them using my recipe, they just took the content down instead.
Crazy. Yeah. I know it's a bigger problem in the tea world where like people use people's photos or videos or recipes, and it's a it's a little shocking that like a celebrity would do that too, especially someone that high profile.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it was some intern that did
Yeah,
it,
probably.
but
Still, but yeah, crazy story. Cool. So, over the years, both being an educator and I'm sure someone who's also like a student of tea, where have you gone to expand your knowledge on matcha? And like, where do you find that some of the sources are for like the bleeding edge of matcha knowledge? Is like more of it gets in English, more of it is findable? Like, where are some really good resources that you've discovered over the year, apart from your blog, where you've also built on your knowledge foundations?
definitely, I would say books are a huge resource for me. One of my favorites are there's a couple of books that were written by Oscar Breckle, which are
Oh,
in
yeah.
both Japanese and English, which is really cool. But really, I feel like his books are about as close to the source as you can get in English. I think definitely for somebody who wants to learn more about Japanese tea, they're a great place to start.
Okay. I got one of them. I forget which one it was, but I found it very helpful. His what do you call them? Like his infographics are really good. Like he was showing lineages of cultivars. I don't know if anyone sells them in the States though. Maybe
I
you can get
don't
them online.
Yeah, for the most part, I've just ordered them through Amazon, but
Oh,
yeah,
really?
they're
Okay.
definitely a huge resource for me.
Okay. I'll have to order the rest because I only have one, but I think there's a couple. Try to pick them up on Amazon. And your book is available at Amazon as well?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, awesome. Cool. So I guess there's one last question before we wrap up. How do you think the matcha landscape is going to change in the next 5 to 10 years? How do you see it evolving from where we're at?
Yeah, I think we're at an interesting time right now. In many ways, demand outseeds supply. So I definitely see the Japanese tea industry kind of pivoting to that. Domestic consumption is down. And so I do think we're going to see a lot of people who were producing sencha or other teas for domestic consumption in Japan are going to be changing over to matcha just because there's customers out there. They may not be Japanese customers, but there's definitely demand for that product. So I do think we're going to see a lot of that changeover. I think we're at a really kind of a difficult time with the Japanese tea industry, because they're definitely having a problem with, farmers aging. Not as many young people are, wanting to take over, but I have not seen interest in matcha be so high as it is now over the last 16 years of me being involved in tea. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how things go from here.
Yeah, and yeah, it really feels like it's only going to grow. So hopefully that the way the Japanese tea industry is structured, that not too much culture is lost. The more past a certain point, the more tea you export, the less tea you have domestically.
Absolutely.
So it's an interesting change. Do you think that the single origin, single cultivar thing is here to stay, or do you think that's just going to remain very, very specialty, or do you think that's going to become more popular?
I think it's potentially going to become more popular. I don't think it's necessarily going to be super mainstream, but I think for people who make matcha at home, I think that's definitely going to be something I think that grows, over time. One example is like Kuzen matcha. They make like a machine that makes grinds tencha into matcha, and the number of people I see using that on TikTok, first of all, but they basically just released a whole collection of single cultivar tencha, which it was like impossible to even get tencha when I first started. So it's really, I think that's interesting that you definitely have people at home that are like learning about different cultivars, grinding their own tencha, which is really, I think, a cool evolution.
Yeah, that's wild. That would have been unthinkable when I
Yeah,
started my tea journey 10 years ago.
absolutely.
Yeah, it's a really cool change. Have you had any of the flavored matcha where it's the purposeful application of flavors?
I haven't. They are very popular though. Like I know David's tea makes a ton of different flavors and they're really like super, super popular. I think it's a great way to make matcha a little bit more approachable for people,
Yeah.
especially if they're just getting started. Somebody, traditional usucha or koicha are intimidating when you're first getting started.
Yeah.
But like matcha lattes are not as scary. So I definitely think it's a good way to help people get their feet.
Yeah, especially because even the vocab when you're first getting into tea, usacha, koicha, and
Mhm.
all these traditional companies with these very complicated names, like they're just I can't even pronounce. Like even some of the big companies, I feel like I can't pronounce their name. Just like I'm an industry person. I'm slowly learning, but I really have a lot of trouble with it. So I can't imagine how like people who are just dipping their toe in the water, trying to like pronounce a lot of these and then remember them. So I think it's a big problem, and I think that's a nice change. Is that you have all these new vendors come in with names that people can remember or relate to in some way, whether or not it's the flavored tea or like I don't know Rocky Matcha or Johnny Matcha. Like they have really approachable names and very good brand identity to remember. I think like without that, I'm worried how much it can grow in the states.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it's super interesting that a lot of Japanese brands have become so popular that they like can't even keep up.
Yeah, that's wild.
Yeah, I keep looking at Sazen Tea's like update page. Somehow they've become like the main vendor of choice for a lot of this, and the number of brands that they're like, there's just no matcha until next June, which is crazy.
It's crazy. Yeah. No, it's the shortages are real.
It's interesting because I feel like no one in the, like, industry is talking about it. Like, I posted on my Facebook just, for I'm friends with a lot of tea vendors on there, and so I was just like and they're all like, "I have matcha, what are you talking about?" And it's like, it's not that you can't get matcha, but there's definitely a lot of brands that are just impossible to get right now, which is really an interesting development.
Yeah, I think from an awareness perspective, maybe it was just very winner take all. Like people
Mhm.
had heard of them, they found great value, they repeat purchased. So hopefully, my hope is that it drives consumers into a state of exploration,
I
try
think
out new vendors, and gives other people more market share. Either that or prices are going to go up, but hopefully that doesn't happen
yeah,
too
hopefully
much,
not.
or both. I don't know. Yeah, much is expensive enough,
Exactly.
especially being such a perishable product. Yeah. Well, anyway, it's a great note to end on. So thank you so much for your time and for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks. And if any of the listeners enjoyed this, please consider giving us 5 stars. Follow Nicole at Tea for Me, please, across various platforms. Check out her YouTube. Her husband, Tea Torture, is very entertaining. Great series. And especially like getting a reaction of someone who's not really a tea person, try something like matcha. It's, if you really are a tea person seeing that, you kind of remember, wow, like not everyone likes tea. So it's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
refreshing perspective.
Yeah, he came to me to Royalty Expo a few years ago, and he's so not a tea person. He was just there to carry my stuff, really. But he we were at a booth, and he like declined a sample, and someone called him a tea hater. And he was like, "I'm not a tea hater," and then he just started chugging everything that was given to him, including matcha. And so that's kind of where the idea came from that, we were like, why don't we just do that at home and have you try different things? Because his responses are always really funny.
Yeah, very funny. Well, it's important to get everyone's preferences, whether they like or dislike something. And I think that's the thing. There's just not enough people out there saying, I don't like this in a really honest and open minded way.
Absolutely.
Well, anyway, thank you so much. And dear listener, we'll see you on the next one. Thanks.